I will start with something pretty basic, and maybe we will cover too much ground in one class. But it is, for me, not very useful to look at these gradations of mind above the ordinary mind unless we first understand the whole context of knowledge. And a good place to start is with a division which the Isha Upanishad makes between two different types of knowledge. It is interesting because what it says about them. So it says there are two types. There is first of all Vidya, which is a good word for knowledge. And Sri Aurobindo translates it specifically as knowledge of the One, means knowledge of the Divine. And the second type, the Isha Kuli calls Avidya, which is often translated as ignorance, though Sri Aurobindo translates it here as knowledge of the many. And what the Isha says about it is quite interesting, because it is just the opposite of what a modern professor would say in a physics class. It says, to know, if you would not know the divine, if you would not know the one, you would live in darkness. That much is obvious. But you should also know the many, because without the knowledge of the many, you will also live in darkness. Now, if you think about it, that's quite interesting, because a modern physics teacher at a university would say the opposite. He would say, obviously, it is useful to know physics, but don't forget that there is also the divine. Yeah? At the moment, we live in a culture that is completely focused on the outside world, on the many. And the divine comes as an afterthought. But in the time of the Isha, it was clearly the other way around. People took that you have to know the divine as automatic and taken for granted. That you also have to know something about the world comes secondary. But in any case, we need both. And we need to know both well. Because we have collectively, at least, collected so much knowledge about the outer world that we have also collected so much power that we are seriously messing up the world. Earlier, we could only mess up our own lives, or if we were a ruler, the lives of the people that we were dealing with. But we may now, if we are not careful, collectively destroy the world in which we live. So it is very high time, it is really a crucial moment in history, that we find another knowledge which is based on oneness, based on harmony. Now the question is, where is that to come from? And the problem is that at the moment the knowledge of the divine that we have and that the Indian tradition has developed in a wonderful way is true, but too limited. It is still, for people who have, say, an intellectual background, the easiest, or maybe even the only possible way of finding something that is genuinely absolute, that is genuinely the divine, is by a negative path, a neti-neti path, or what in the Christian tradition was called the via negativa. Yeah? You throw out your thoughts, you throw out your feelings, you throw out your sensations, you throw out everything. And then suddenly you flip your consciousness into a light, a delight, something eternal, of which you know that it is so important that even if the whole wide world would disappear in pralaya, it would make no difference to anything. Yeah? Because that thing that you have found is so eternal and so absolute and so great that the whole rest doesn't matter. And because people had found all kind of shortcuts to that kind of knowledge, the Isha had to warn, but hey, this is not yet enough. We need also to understand what is there behind the many. So they had found a way of finding the divine, but only one aspect of it. The absolute, the transcendent, in Buddhism, the emptiness. but not the fullness. They had not seen the real truth behind the creation. And the reason for that is that the knowledge of the many that we have makes use of our nature. In the knowledge of the divine, you can make a shortcut and get rid of your nature. You can concentrate only on love for the divine or only on knowledge of the divine. And you can chuck out everything else. And you'll find it. But it is just one corner. To know the divine in its completeness, you need something akin to the completeness of our nature. And to transform our nature is way beyond the capacity of the traditional forms of yoga. That just cannot be done. And one of the key problems is a problem of knowledge. And fascinatingly, modern science is hard at work to discover from where the ignorance came. It is discovering a problem that, as far as I have understood Shankara said, I can't understand this. From where has Maya come? Yeah. How did we arrive at ignorance? If the divine knows everything, if the divine is good, then how could he possibly create ignorance? And modern science seems to have worked that out, and is very proud of it also, because it calls itself the founder of a knowledge society. It doesn't realize that it is still ignorance. And the reason is that all our scientific knowledge is still constructed knowledge. It has a core of intuitive knowledge in the form of mathematics, in the form of the intuitions that scientists get. But as a whole, it is a body of constructed knowledge. And it is constructed in our brains. And I think we are probably the first generations that understand at least a little bit how the material stuff of our brain converts itself into a model of reality. And just like a rock identifies with its being a rock, and a river knows it is a river, we identify with the workings of that brain. And that brain is not by itself. We have so much problem of finding out who we are because our brain is a model of the rest of reality. That's its job. And so we are misguided by the secondary nature of the kind of knowledge that we produce in our brains about the surface reality. So all the knowledge that we have misguides us because it is not the knowledge that is inherent in creation, but it is something that is secondarily made on top of that. And that is where the problem arises. Now, to understand how we got into that fix, it is good to go very quickly over the involution and evolution of consciousness. Because if you understand from where our bodies have come and how they work, then you can understand why we are all the time fooling ourselves. Because we are still animals that use a little bit of material stuff to make a bit of constructed knowledge about the outer reality. And that is quite a different thing than the original knowledge that has created the world. It is informed by it. It works with it. It cannot do without mathematics, for example. But it is not the genuine inherent knowledge that you can get by going inside. So, the evolution of consciousness. We all know that we have started with matter and then developed life, plants, little animals, and then mind. Yeah, this all of us have learned in our school education. In matter, consciousness is kind of locked up in itself. A physical thing has no choices. So there is no active will, but it knows exactly how to be itself forever. Yeah, this is the absolute embodiment of tamas. And it is perfect in that regard. So the amount of knowledge in an electron or in a rock is not small. It must know all of physics and everything that has any impact on it, because it behaves always exactly according to the laws of physics. It's not a small thing. We can look down on it, but that's pure nonsense. Yeah? Then if you go next to life force, it is way more complicated, and we don't need to go in detail, but it is typically the embodiment of rajas. It is into self-assertiveness, possession, drama, the whole stuff. And then we have the mind. And in mind consciousness, there's two things. The basic thing that mind is doing is what I said. It produces, it constructs an image of reality. So it produces a secondary kind of knowledge, not a knowledge that is intrinsic from inside out, but a knowledge that is based on sense perception and so on. Yeah? And it is fantastic in that job. Yeah? But it is still, even in its most fancy achievements, it is still a secondary production. It is a copy of reality. It is not reality itself. Yeah? All human knowledge is dualistic. The knower is different from the known and different from the knowledge. Yeah? So it is intrinsically dualistic, and reality is not. There is no reason to assume that dualism exists in reality outside the mind. It is something that's entirely a production of mental consciousness. It splits. And physically it splits because it is the consciousness of a thing that has turned itself into a model of all the other things. Yeah, it's quite peculiar, but we have to live with it, and that's it. Now, this is not a very pleasant state of affairs, because obviously when we think that we are small creatures in a huge universe that's not always sympathetic to our existence, we come to the conclusion, like the Buddha, that everything is in the end temporary and suffering. So the best thing is to go out. So we can do that, which is, again, very amazing. But we can silence our mind, as Patanjali wanted us to do. We can find that emptiness. It is a human possibility. Not everybody manages, not everybody knows Sanskrit, not everybody knows mathematics. But in principle, it is a human possibility. And strange enough, if we throw everything out of our consciousness increases. It is diminished by its content. It is not made by its content. Yeah? So there is something very interesting there. But it's not sufficient, because once we are out, we have our delight, but it doesn't really help to act better in the world. A little bit, because we don't need to be so egoistic as most people are. But it is very difficult to change your character. And if you don't change your character, you can never express that higher reality or that higher consciousness. And there is where our problem comes. Now, if you look at this from a little wider perspective, you can look at the evolution of consciousness as the consequence of an involution of consciousness. And interestingly, that has been described very precisely in some Indian scriptures. The big picture looks like this. There is an involution and there is an evolution. Great, yeah? The evolution is the part that science has discovered. And it has discovered only the physical part of it. So it knows that there is matter. It knows that there is a life force which is embodied in matter. That's the interesting part. During evolution, it is not that life escapes from matter. Yeah? When life came, you didn't get wafts of vital energy. You got butterflies and birds and tigers. Yeah? So we have an embodied life. And now we have an embodied mind. And nature is working very hard on it, because say 100 years ago or 200 years ago, the vast majority of mankind was physically busy with their hands. They had to labor to find food, basically, and later to find things. And now, almost everybody has a mentally challenging job. Yeah? People who clean the roads used to do it with a sweeper and a stick, and now they sit in immensely complicated automated trucks all alone, trying to operate that huge machine that cleans the road. Yeah? So every single job has become more mentally complicated and challenging. So the whole of humanity is busy developing the mind. And we are good at it, no doubt about that, within its limit. Now, from where has that mind come? From where has that life come? Why have these stupid rocks not continued to be rocks? And according to the Indian tradition, that is because there is an involution that preceded the evolution. Yeah? It starts with Satchitananda, and then you get the subtle mental planes, the subtle vital planes, the pranamaya kosha, and then you get the subtle physical planes. And then we are where we are now in that embodied mind, and we have found a trick to go back to that initial Satchitananda. Yeah, that is the great finding of the Indian spirituality. But Sri Aurobindo got very deeply puzzled by the gap between Satchitananda and the mental plane. And he discovered that as he went to explore what exactly happens after you've reached that Satchitananda and you're not leaving the world, you're not just satisfied of having that top, but you want to explore all the levels in between. And he spent many, many years meticulously exploring that world in between the two. And then he realized that the highest layers that have been described in later Vedanta are still not good enough. They are still part of the ordinary light, of the ordinary consciousness, the mind. And there are the very first beginnings of dualism, which you have in the Indian tradition because you have, a Shaivite tradition and you have a Vaisnavite tradition. Yeah? And all the religions come from a layer where there is a contact with the truth, but also the beginning of separation. And that is why these religions cannot stand each other very well, because they found the divine, but the moment they give a form to it, it changes from the divine into my divine. And then my divine is different from your divine. So, and then all the trouble starts. So, Sri Aurobindo said there must be something else that has made the world. Because the kind of mind that we have, this dualistic mind that gets inevitably in conflict, whatever it tries, cannot have created the world in all the beauty that it has. So he said there must be an entirely non-dual consciousness, where there's really no trace of egoism or separatingness or whatever, that yet allows the many. So something that is manifest, that is not amorphous, that is not only void, that is not only transcendent, but that is cosmic and even individual. And it is entirely not ignorant and not dual. Many people have thought they got there because they got shadows from that higher plane. But you can easily find that they didn't find that plane by itself, because otherwise there would have been no conflict about their further existence. And there always is. So we haven't found it yet. But he said it must be there. And then he found that there are actually hints about that in-between plane in the Rig Veda. But they're kind of hints. They don't describe it as something that you could make part of daily life. So that is what he called the supramental plane, which is just an indication somewhere beyond the mind. And he uses sometimes the word Vijnana Maya, but that's confusing because later that word degraded. Till now it just means higher education. So when you use that word, most people will misunderstand because they take it for something much, much lower than what Sri Aurobindo meant with it. So if there is a plane between the original creation and the world that has manifested so far, then given the fact that the evolution is a kind of re-inverting movement of the involution, we can expect that the long future will include a physical embodiment of the supramental consciousness. And according to what Sri Aurobindo figured out of that type of consciousness, it is actually not only bigger than the difference between, say, man and a monkey, it is bigger than the difference between man and a plant. Because there is really no trace of ignorance anymore. Our mind is always trying to find knowledge. It doesn't have it intrinsically. And this would be a knowledge that is completely intrinsically true from inside out. And a power that is intrinsically in harmony with everything else, because it is the power of the divine. So it is a radical change, not only from our modern thinking, but it's a radical change from being human. And it is in some ways quite different from traditional Advaita Vedanta, because in Advaita Vedanta, once you have overcome the ignorance, yourself becomes one with the Paramatman and becomes one with Brahman, and that's it. It disappears. While according to Sri Aurobindo's idea, we are part of a long-standing involution and evolution, and we are portions of the divine, each one in its own way. And so there is a persistent individuality. Not our ordinary characters, not the way we look at present, luckily not, yeah, but there is something in us that is a permanent portion of the divine. The divine is Ananta Guna, has everything. Infinite qualities, we have a portion of it, which is our Svabhava and Swadharma. Not only in a limited sense of the type of thing that we have to do in this life, but in the deepest sense that it is that what we are for eternity, the thing that we have to learn to express in matter. So it extends the adventure enormously. It is not anymore a matter of finding the divine and chalo, bye-bye, we're gone. But it is working forwards to a radically new way of existing. And it is far more radical than we can think, because when we see the reality, we see, for example, that things have colors. But all the light that we see is reflected light. Yeah? We don't see things, we see the light that reflects on the surfaces of things. There is nothing that we know directly from inside out. Never. We have some fake notion. We know that the world is somewhere familiar, that it belongs to the same reality that we belong to, if we are not schizophrenic in some way. But the details we don't know. The details are all second-hand. And so a life in which you would be intrinsically in harmony with everything. And in knowing everything how it is by itself, not the way we see it with our indirect visual and auditive and constructed knowledge. So it is a much more radical change. People have often asked them, how will the supramental body look? But it's not just our body that will look differently. It may look to ordinary people the same as our body looks now or not. And it doesn't matter at all. The thing is, the entire reality in our consciousness will be different, because our consciousness will be different. So nothing in reality will be same to what it is now. So it is much more radical than most people realize. So the big project is to get our liberation, put it in our pocket, take it, and then move on to the next stage in the evolution. Now, there are some problems on the way. And one of them is that... okay, before this, I just want to take 1 minute to take a little passage from the Mundaku Upanishad. Because these Upanishads are far more amazing than people realize. Yeah? In this part of the Mundaka, it is said, the immutable, the Brahman, who is forever himself, created the world out of itself, just as a spider creates a web out of its own body. Yeah? When this news reached Europe for the first time, people made fun of it. They thought, hey, these strange Indians, they think the divine is a spider. And they completely didn't get the point. But the point is very simple. The divine has made the world out of itself. Just as the earth creates herbs, just as the head and body of a living man produce hair. If people don't get it, or they take it too literal and think about spiders, then the next sentence says the same thing, more abstract. So from him, from Brahman, from the divine consciousness, matter is born. Out of matter, life and mind. And then comes truth. Yeah? And truth is that supramental plane that Sri Aurobindo talks about. Yeah? You have matter, and then you have life, and then you have mind, and then you have truth. Something radically different than the preceding one. And then you have all this knowledge of the inner worlds, which is all there. And out of work, out of the things we do in life, we find our immortality. That also needs to be understood, because as far as we can make out, these rishis were not engineers. They didn't think about immortality in the sense that we think that you can make a body that will last forever. That's not the point. They were seekers. So you become eternal when you find that you actually are eternal. When you know that your soul is eternal, you are eternal. There's nothing whether your body becomes eternal or not becomes very secondary. So out of your karma, out of your work, immortality comes. And then he still summarizes the whole thing, and he says, he who is the omniscient, the all-wise, he, whose energy is all made out of knowledge. Yeah. So there again, the whole world has that knowledge already in it. Yeah? It is just that it is not yet coming out. It is just not yet manifesting itself fully. From him is born this that is Brahman here, this name and form and matter. Yeah? So in our present world, it all looks quite constricted. You can give it names, it has forms, but all that is quite secondary. But it's an amazing piece of text. And one crux of it is this little word of truth that comes in the middle. I hope the crackers in my neighborhood don't disturb too much. All right. So we continue. And so we have this sevenfold cord of being, this long layer, Satchitananda on top, mind, life, and body below, and that supermind in the middle. Now, the big hitch is that new type of understanding, that knowledge that has true knowledge not only of the divine in its transcendent aspect, but that has true knowledge of the divine in its completeness, of the entire manifestation. And there are many layers in between that very often have been taken by people as the highest non-dual type of mind. It is not unusual to see that in literature. The first thing is something that comes quite close to the ordinary mind, but it is, when you go there, it is a bit as if you find the answer book of a mathematics manual or something like that. You see immediately how everything hangs together. Sri Aurobindo says it is a mind no longer of a mingled light and obscurity or half-light, but a large clarity of the spirit. Its basic substance is a unitarian sense of being with a powerful multiple dynamization capable of the formation of a multitude of aspects of knowledge, ways of action, forms and significances of becoming, all of which there is a spontaneous inherent knowledge. It is a luminous thought mind, a mind of spirit-born conceptual knowledge, conceiving swiftly, victoriously, multitudinously, formulating and by self-power of the idea effectually realizing its conceptions. So typically people who have this, they think they've got it because they see all the answers, and they also see immediately in a kind of inner certainty how all the answers hang together. So they understand why all the different people and the different philosophies have slightly different views of the same underlying reality. Yeah? But it is still dualistic. It is still bound to language. It is still a human mind which only got its ideas right from inside. But it is still an ordinary mind. And the joy that comes with it, the beauty that it has, the inner harmony that comes, is all reflected. It is not the light in itself. It is a reflection of the higher intuitive knowledge in the ordinary mind. But it is a kind of mind from which it is still quite possible to write and to talk and so on and so on. So the next step above that is something that Sri Aurobindo calls the illumined mind. And he writes, here the clarity of the spiritual intelligence, its tranquil daylight, gives place or subordinates itself to an intense luster, a splendor and illumination of the spirit. A play of lightnings of spiritual truth and power breaks from above into the consciousness. And it adds a rapturous ecstasy of knowledge. Yeah? So the problem is here, this you can have, but it is not possible to share it fully. Yeah? Because it is a rapturous ecstasy. But it doesn't mean that you are any better into writing it out or sharing it with others. It is really an interior experience of light. And even this is not the original source of the higher knowledge. It is still a reflection somehow in the world of physical light. It is a reflection in the world of close to that thinking mind in which we normally operate. And so there is something above it, which he calls intuition. And there is an interesting distinction he makes between intuition as we have it in the ordinary life, where we have a little bit of higher knowledge that kind of intrudes in our ignorance. And when you have a mind that works like that, where intuitions come, he calls that the intuitive mind. But the plane is not called intuitive mind. The plane he calls intuition, just as a name of a plane. And about that he writes this. Intuition is a power of consciousness, nearer and more intimate to the original knowledge by identity. For it is always something that leaps out direct from a concealed identity. It is when consciousness of a subject meets with the consciousness in the object, penetrates it, sees, feels, or vibrates with the truth of what it contacts, that the intuition leaps out like a spark or lightning flash from the shock of the meeting. Or when a consciousness, even without any such meeting, looks into itself and feels directly and intimately the truth or the truths that are there, or so contacts the hidden forces behind appearances. Then also there is the outbreak of an intuitive light. Or again, when the consciousness meets the supreme reality or the spiritual reality of things and beings and has a contextual union with it, then the spark, the flash, or the blaze of intimate truth perception is lit in its depths. It is he calls this the beginning of a knowledge by identity, in the sense that your consciousness contacts, by intimate direct contact, the consciousness of something else or of an idea or of someone, and knows that other thing or person or idea by itself from inside. And the fascinating thing is that many people have this once in a while. Suddenly you really just know how someone else feels, or you know something that you have no business knowing. And so it's not that unusual. But Sri Aurobindo says that there is a whole world that's entirely built on that, and that we in principle can move there. Now, from that plane of intuition, different powers can come down. So one power he calls the power of revelation, of revelatory true seeing, where you just simply see what is right and know that what you see is the truth. There is also a power of inspiration or truth hearing, which he seems to have used a lot in his poetry, where you have inevitable formulations where there is no way you can improve the way text runs. Then there is a power of what he calls truth touch, or immediate seizing of the significance of something. The power of true and automatic discrimination of how all these truths are related to each other. These are the fourfold potencies of intuition. And so, Sri Aurobindo concludes that intuition can therefore perform all the actions of reason, including the functions of the logical intelligence, which is to work out the right relation of things and the right relations of idea with idea, but by its own superior processes. So intuition is the highest form of knowledge that is still individualized. Yeah? It is still centered in one person. It is not cosmic, but the things it arrives at are true. So it's not a small, and all these things that come from the higher mind or the illumined mind or the inspirations and intuitions we have, they come from that plane. Now, beyond this intuition, there is a plane of the overmind, which I already hinted at in the beginning, which very many people in the Indian tradition have regarded as the highest level where there is still differentiation. And it is the plane from where the major religions seem to come. So there is no trace of ego anymore. It's not individual. It is genuinely cosmic. And he writes like this: the overmind is a power of cosmic consciousness, a principle of global knowledge which carries in it a delegated light from the supramental gnosis. It is therefore only by an opening into that cosmic consciousness that the overmind ascent and descent can be made wholly possible. A high and intense individual opening upwards is not sufficient. To that vertical ascent towards summit light, there must be added a vast horizontal expansion of the consciousness in some totality of the spirit. He writes this because it is possible, especially in samadhi, in an inner trance, to surpass this layer, to kind of jump out of the overmind straight to the Anandamaya Kosha. And then you have the perfection, but without that cosmic whiteness, without the fullness of the knowledge of the One that we started with. Yeah? And that is the hitch. But because you have that perfection, you may not either be aware or even bother about the limitation. So this is that. And then when the overmind descends, the predominance of the centralizing ego sense is, or has to be, entirely subordinated. It lost in largeness of being and finally abolished. A wide cosmic perception and feeling of a boundless universal self and movement replaces it. Not only the separate ego, but all sense of individuality, even of a subordinated or instrumental individuality, may entirely disappear. Yeah? That is that sense that your Atman disappears into the Paramatman. If the delight or the center of force is felt in what was the personal mind, life or body, it is not with a sense of personality, but as a field of manifestation. And this sense of the delight or of the action of force is not confined to the person or the body, but can be felt at all points in an unlimited consciousness of unity, which pervades everywhere. And the fascinating thing is that the Buddhists have defined this as there is no center, there's no self. The Advaita Vedantins have said it is an infinite self that encompasses everything. And there is an inner place where you can kind of jump from one experience to the other. They are very close cousins or neighbors or whatever. But they're still different. There is a difference between feeling that there is no center of the consciousness and the sense of being infinite. And Sri Aurobindo says that in the supramental, these things finally really come together. But then, indeed, the ordinary mind has to be completely out. So I'll show just one more slide where Sri Aurobindo indicates the difference between that overmind and the supermind itself. He has tried at many, many places to explain the difference, and he complained that in the end of all his writing, nobody had understood. So one of the places where he writes in a letter is, although the overmind draws from the truth, it is here that begins the separation of aspects of the truth, the forces and their working out as if they were independent truths. And this is a process that ends as one descends to ordinary mind, life and matter in a complete division, fragmentation, separation from the indivisible truth above. In other words, there is no longer the essential, total, perfectly harmonizing and unifying knowledge, or rather knowledge forever harmonious because forever one, which is the character of supermind. In the supermind, mental divisions and oppositions cease. The problems created by our dividing and fragmenting mind disappear, and truth is seen as a luminous whole. Here I stop, because first of all, this is beyond my reach or ken, and obviously you cannot say anything sensible about it because language doesn't allow it. So our next slide is as it should be empty. Maybe a little Buddhist influence is there. And I have still a few links where if anybody is interested, they can find some more information. The last two are a little bit more formal. It is more in the language of science. But if you don't mind plowing through that, then there is a description. And otherwise, of course, by far the best thing is simply to go back to the Life Divine Synthesis of Yoga, Letters on Yoga, and Savitri.